Ambassador Hurst. Prime Minister Johnson, I am now going to give you the podium to do your thing.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Georgette, Ambassador Mosbach. It's a great honor to be here before you, before such a distinguished audience. And I have a three-word message for you today, and it is God bless America. God bless America for what you have done and are doing to save Ukraine from destruction. I'm, of course, proud of all the efforts made by the United Kingdom and other European allies to support Ukraine, the billions of humanitarian assistance, the NLAW missiles that we sent, the tanks that we're sending. And, of course, the real heroes are the people of Ukraine, their troops who are fighting like lions, the families who've put up with suffering and cruelty on a scale not seen since the Second World War. But we all must acknowledge, and I acknowledge today, the scale of American support, military and financial. And the real possibility, the likelihood even, that without that support and the confidence that American support bred in the Ukrainians, then Putin would have taken Kiev in the blitzkrieg that he planned. And he would have installed a puppet government, and a terrible darkness would have fallen on a young and entirely innocent European democracy. Because we've now seen what Russian occupation means, and we know what's going on in the areas that Russia still occupies. We've seen the horrors that Putin's troops leave behind when they're pushed out. Across the whole of that vast and bitterly resisting country, as it would have been, he would have imposed a police state more vile and dreadful than anything we saw in the former Eastern Bloc. Systematic murder, torture, rape, detention without trial, systematic movement of populations, including children, and all the time, the crazed and a chauvinistic attempt to impose Putin's ideology that Ukraine is not really a country, that, as he thinks, Ukrainian language and culture are folkloric curiosities, and that the primary destiny of the Ukrainian population is to be part of the Russian Federation. And if that tragedy had taken place, and who knows how close we came in those first few weeks, then that would have been the pivotal and the defining moment of the first part of the 21st century. If Putin had won a year ago, as he thought he would, as his generals told him he was going to, indeed, frankly, as our generals, ladies and gentlemen, told him he was going to, then that would have emboldened the Kremlin to increase the intimidation and threats towards every country and region on the fringes of the old Soviet empire. It would have told the Chinese all they need to know about our reluctance to stand up for freedom and democracy in the South China Seas or anywhere. It would have sent a signal to every opportunist autocrat around the world that international borders are fungible and frangible and can be changed by force, and that no one will do a damn thing to stop them. And the guilt for the whole Ukrainian tragedy would then have been upon us all. So God bless America for having the guts and the wisdom to help. And I implore you now to follow the logic of what you are all doing and give the Ukrainians the tools to finish the job. Give them the deep fire artillery systems. Give them the tanks. Give them the planes, because they have a plan. They know what they need to do, and my God, they've shown they have the skill and the bravery to do it. Give them the wherewithal to take back that land bridge and the rest of their country, because the faster they win, the greater the savings in treasure and in lives, and the faster the world economy will bounce back to health. The prize before us is now immense. When Ukraine wins, and they will win, when Putin is pushed back, we will lift the threat of further Russian aggression in Georgia, in Moldova, in the Baltic states, across the whole of Eastern Europe. And by lifting that threat, we end the risk of further economic disruption, like the hikes in the cost of gas and food that have affected people in my country, in the UK, in this country, and around the world. When Ukraine wins, we will have established a new clarity and a new stability in the security architecture of Europe. And we will have ended the fateful ambiguity that in the end encouraged Putin to make his catastrophic mistake. And for a relatively tiny outlay in expenditure, we will have greatly strengthened the entire Euro-Atlantic area. And bear in mind that America's contribution is noble and huge, but it is still only 5 or 6% of the annual US defense budget so far, and has helped to degrade about 20%, some say 50%, of Putin's war machine. And to those who say we may be somehow denuding our own arsenals by giving this support, I say, what is the point in deploying those tanks and planes in North Carolina or North Rhine-Westphalia or Alsace when the Ukrainians could be using them now exactly where they are needed to help assure our collective security for decades? What is the point of having Challenger tanks patrolling the beautiful villages of Wiltshire, which is a very safe area, I can tell you, when the Ukrainians could be using them now to bring this war to an end? Every time we've been asked to intensify our support, we've been met with the same argument that we risk an escalation by Putin. How can we seriously worry about provoking him when we have seen what he will do without the slightest provocation? He isn't mad. He isn't ill. He simply made a historic, that's what I'm afraid all the evidence says, he simply made a historic miscalculation and is struggling to deal with the position in which he has now placed his own country. He won't use nuclear weapons because it would instantly extinguish the last flicker of Chinese support. It would lose him every one of the world's swing voters from India to Africa to Latin America. He would terrify his own people if he did so, who would live in dread of the consequences for them. He would plunge Russia into such a cryogenic freeze of economic isolation as to make the present sanctions regime seem like a blessing. And it would not even work, because I don't believe for a minute he would stop the Ukrainians from fighting for their hearths and their homes and their families. And so we mustn't fall for this trick of trying to portray, that he does, of trying to portray this conflict as a standoff between a nuclear-armed NATO and a nuclear-armed Russia, because that is not what is happening here. We are seeing a barbaric attack on an innocent country, and we are simply giving the Ukrainians the means to protect themselves, as you might help a neighbor whose house is under attack from an arsonist. Do you give that person a hose and buckets and fire blankets? Yes, you do. And above all, we need to avoid being drawn into Putin's personal psychodrama. We're not here to worry about the next stage of his career or what happens in the Kremlin. We need to stop focusing on Putin and focus entirely on Ukraine, because they are fighting for all of us, everyone in this room. They're fighting for our values, and they have reminded us that those values of freedom and democracy are worth fighting for. So there are no conceivable grounds for delay. Let us end this pipette titration of support and give the Ukrainians the support they need to finish this war in the only way that it can and will be finished, and let us give them those tools now. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for your support for Ukraine.
Mr. Johnson, that was terrific, and your leadership on this issue has been terrific. I dare say that when Great Britain made the decision, under your leadership, to send anti-ship missiles to Ukraine, you prodded less resolute Western leaders to do the same, and the Brits have again led on tanks, prodding less resolute Western leaders to do the same. So congratulations. But I want to start with one technical question first, because while many people in our audience understand these issues in their bones, others do not. You referred to the land bridge.
Yes.
Would you please explain it so people understand its
Yes.
strategic significance?
Forgive me, Ambassador. What I was talking about, as everybody in this room, I'm sure knows, and most people know, this is the area between, as it were, Mariupol, between the Donbass and the Crimea area that Putin has taken. That long strip of land that basically prevents the Ukrainians from reaching the Azov Sea. That's the area. Now, if they take that back, which they can, and they have a plan, if they can take back Melitopol and Berdyansk and Mariupol, get back those areas, it's game over for Putin, and that's what needs to happen.
Okay, thank you. All right, critics of the administration, the Biden administration, which as you point out has done a very good job of setting a framework for dealing with Putin's aggression, say that Russia's war in Ukraine is of no consequence to the United States, and therefore we should cut off or severely reduce our support for Ukraine. What do you make of that?
Well, I just repeat what I said. This is, let's not be penny wise and pound foolish, or cent wise or dollar foolish, or however you would put it here. Let's not have a false economy. By helping the Ukrainians to win decisively, you massively assure the security of the Euro-Atlantic area. If you fail to do that, if Putin comes away from this with anything like a victory or something he can present as a victory, then he remains a threat to all those regions around the periphery of the old Soviet Union. And the cost to America, the cost to our children in having to protect those areas would be borne for decades to come. So let's avoid that pointless expenditure, that instability and that insecurity, and get this war done now.
So the United States has a vital interest in ensuring Putin loses in Ukraine.
I believe that it's a vital interest of the US and the whole West to ensure that Putin loses in Ukraine, that Ukraine succeeds for the reason I've just given, because otherwise we're spending billions and billions trying to protect all the areas that a revanchist Russia could still attack. That's the first thing. But don't forget the message that Putin's success would send to China. I mean, this is a dry run for Xi Jinping. There's a very good reason why Beijing decided to greenlight this appalling operation or to acquiesce in it. They want to see how it will go because the Chinese, of course, have objectives of their own. Do we want that to happen? Absolutely, emphatically not. That's why we have to stand up to Putin now.
Okay. The Biden administration says that it will be with Zelensky in this fight as long as it takes, but it avoids stating a clear objective, such as a Ukrainian victory or a Russian defeat. What should the West's aim be?
Look, we can't. I mean, it's wonderful to have some Ukrainian people here, but we can't be more Ukrainian than the Ukrainians. It's for them to decide what they think the victory is. But my own instinct, having talked to President Zelensky quite a bit, is that the absolute minimum is to take back, as I say, the land bridge. But realistically, they should be taking back their entire country. Never forget that the origins of this catastrophe lie in our collective failure in 2014 to do enough to punish Putin for his decision to change borders by force then.
Good point. Okay. Ambassador Mosbacher referred to your op-ed in the Washington Post, and I agree, everyone should read it. You talk about Ukraine joining NATO. Do you think Ukraine should now be offered membership? How does this play out?
My thinking about this has changed, right? So that's basically, if you'd asked me before the conflict, was Ukraine going to be joining NATO anytime soon, I'd have said in private, I would have said you must be joking. I mean, it was clear that there simply wasn't a consensus around the table in NATO for this to happen. There were all sorts of reasons why you could theoretically object to Ukrainian membership anyway. It wasn't a realistic possibility. But the problem was that we kept sucking and blowing at once, and we kept saying, or trying to. I don't think you can do that. I haven't.
If anyone can, you can.
If anyone, and we said NATO had enough kind of encouraging language about Ukraine joining the alliance to give Putin the pretext to say that this was going to happen. But at the same time, we went around the Ukrainians back, we were constantly telling the Russians this isn't going to happen. We were constantly saying to the French and the Germans and everybody else who was a bit hesitant, of course, this isn't going to happen till the Greek cal ends and till hell, Hades freezes over. So we were talking out of both sides of our mouth, and Putin basically exploited that. I've now come to the conclusion that Putin has demolished any objections to Ukrainian membership. If the objection was that we were going to provoke Russian aggression, well, that is now transparently absurd. Russian aggression has followed our failure to admit Ukraine into NATO. Not having Ukraine in NATO produced the worst war in Europe for 80 years. Okay? What is needed now is clarity and simplicity and the security and stability that the North Atlantic Alliance gives. And I believe that once this war is done and once the Ukrainians have won, then yes, they should begin the process of induction both to NATO and, of course, to the EU.
The logic you just laid out is very much, I think, what Henry Kissinger did in his latest statement at Davos a few weeks back. But are you confident, we reach that point after the war, Ukraine has won, that in Paris, in Berlin, Budapest, Vienna, not Vienna, Budapest, there will be a welcome mat for Ukraine and NATO?
No, I think it'll be a very chewy argument. And you could see what, even with Finland and Sweden, which is an incredible thing. You could not have a more eloquent demonstration of the aggression of Vladimir Putin than the decision by the Swedish and the Finnish population to go for NATO membership. After all this time, after all their almost sanctified neutrality, right, they're giving it up. Yeah, there will be some tough conversations with a lot of countries. But the argument is overwhelming. What is the argument against? That it'll provoke Putin? Oh, sorry, we had that. We managed to provoke Putin by not having Ukraine in NATO. It could not be clearer.
Okay. You went into this a little bit in your set remarks, but I'll come back to it anyways, because some of the budget-minded critics of the administration talk about the expense of our support for Ukraine, and they seem to ignore the enhanced security that comes to us from this. What else would you say to persuade them that this is the smart bet? It's a false economy to let Putin win. You're burdening future generations with the massive expense of trying to protect the whole area, and it'll be a burden on American taxpayers for a long time to come. Okay.
Plus, all the points about China.
Some apologists.
Plus,
Please.
Plus, I mean, there's the additional and not unimportant point that allowing the Ukrainians to protect themselves and their families and to prevent them from being overrun by a barbaric regime happens to be the morally right thing to do. And the United States has a distinguished record, having exhausted all the alternatives, of doing the right thing. And that's what's happening now.
Again, some people who are against strong American support and Western support for Ukraine argue that this crisis goes back not just, for example, to the discussion of Ukraine joining NATO, but the actual enlargement of NATO back in the 90s. What do you think about that?
Yeah, John, I'll just go back to what I said. I think that, we made a mistake in that we were continually talking about Ukrainian membership in such a way as to allow Putin to claim that NATO membership was on the cards for Ukraine and to use it as a pretext, but without actually offering the hard security that goes with NATO membership, nothing like it. And so that's why we had this catastrophe. Of course, Putin didn't invade because he was worried about Ukraine joining NATO. He invaded because he is a revanchist and a neo-imperialist who believes the greatest disaster of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Empire, which I think many people in this room would say was one of the great liberating and optimistic moments of the 20th century.
Okay. You touched upon this too, but I think it deserves a little bit more attention. Putin is a master psychologist, and he has carried out what I call an elaborate psyops operation to convince the West that he's willing to use nuclear weapons over Ukraine. As you made public yesterday, he threatened you personally in a phone call with missiles. Even though he has made this threat numerous times, whether it regards Finland and Sweden joining NATO, whether it regards Ukrainian military operations in Russian-declared territory in 4 oblasts in eastern Ukraine, and not carried through, people still take this seriously. Your thoughts on this?
Well, so I just repeat what I really don't think we should get sucked into his narrative. He wants to frame this as a confrontation between nuclear-armed NATO and nuclear-armed Putin, and that's how he wants us to think about it. And he's like the fat boy in Dickens. He wants to make our flesh creep. He wants to spook us. That's what he was up to in that phone call. We mustn't. It's a rabbit hole. This is a much simpler problem. This is about, and he won't, I believe, use nuclear weapons. I think it's vanishingly unlikely for the reasons, 4 or 5 reasons I gave in my opening remarks. The impact in China, the impact on the swing voters around the world, the catastrophic economic consequences for Russia, the apprehensions of the Russian people themselves, and the strategic fact that actually the Ukrainians will probably fight on and win anyway. So look, I don't think that that's going to happen. Focus on Ukraine and getting them the stuff they need.
Okay. Some people in the West are now calling for a ceasefire in place. Others say that such a ceasefire would simply enable Putin to rebuild his army and then come back for the rest of Ukraine. Your thoughts on this?
I agree with the second group.
Okay, good. Look, I already mentioned that the UK has been a real leader in the West in pushing for more weapons to Ukraine. What do you think Ukraine needs now to successfully take the land bridge and win this war?
Look, I'm not a military man, but I think that they need what I'm told by the president of Ukraine is what they need is they need longer range missile systems so that they can artillery systems so that they can take out Putin's command and control, ammo dumps and so forth. Logistics over 70 kilometers away, more than 70 kilometers away. They need that because they can see what's happening, but they can't hit it, and they're being hit by a lot of stuff that they know is there, but they can't take out. So they need those longer range, those deep fires. Then they need the armor actually to retake and hold the ground, the heavy armor, the armored cars, and I'm told they need planes. And I hear that an objection to their having sophisticated Western planes to fly is that they won't know how to use them. I have to say I take that argument with a bit of a pinch of salt.
That argument has come up frequently, going back to when we provided counter-battery radar for missiles. We told they couldn't understand it. And in fact, they used it better than we ever did.
Some of you may not know, but I'm lucky enough to represent the constituency of Uxbridge and South Ruislip in the west of London. Where in the Second World War was based the famous 303 Squadron, which was flown by Polish pilots. And never forget that the Poles in the Second World War, in the Battle of Britain, took out 1 in 7 of the Nazi planes that were shot down in the Battle of Britain. And it didn't take long for those Polish pilots to understand how to use a Hawker Hurricane or a Spitfire. And I don't think it would take the Ukrainians very long to work out how to use F-16s or Typhoons or whatever we have to give them.
I'm a personal collector of bad arguments why we can't provide Ukraine the support it needs.
Yes.
And one of the latest is the notion that if somehow Ukraine had a big victory, which we both expect, Russia will come crashing down, and this would be a disaster. Your thoughts on this?
Well, again, we mustn't get wrapped up in what could or couldn't happen in Russia. What might happen in the Kremlin, what might happen to Putin's political career, and so on. I don't think that will necessarily happen, but people were very apprehensive about the fall of the Soviet Union. They said that would be a disaster. I mean, not just within the Soviet Union. They said it turned out to be a very benign event. I'm not saying that. Look, it is very, very important for this whole argument that we should not drift or allow ourselves to be captured by some conversation about what could or could not happen in Russia or in Moscow. This is not about that. This is about helping the Ukrainians to expel a ruthless invader.
Okay. From the widespread use of torture, raping of women and children, the kidnapping of children, massive air attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, this is a war of war crimes. And there are now efforts to substantiate these crimes and bring Russian leaders and Russian participants in war crimes to justice. What is your assessment of these efforts?
Well, it's going to be very difficult, but it's vital that it is done. And Putin's people, his hench people, they need to know that they're going to be brought to justice. And I think we should give every possible support to the Ukrainians, legally, evidentially, to allow them to assemble the cases against those who have committed atrocities. And by the way, it is of course essential that at the same time that the Ukrainians show that when people on their side sadly have committed atrocities, that they should be brought to justice as well. And I think that's a point that needs to be made.
Okay, good. Thank you. The damage Russia has inflicted on Ukraine's economy is estimated at a minimum of $500 billion. As you know, approximately $300 billion in Russian assets have been frozen in the international financial system. Canada has passed legislation which enable them to take assets in Canada for transfer to Ukraine. Do you think other Western countries should follow this example?
I'm attracted to this, and you know, I can see various counter arguments, but I think it's certainly something we should hold in reserve.
Okay, thank you. I've done down my list of questions, which are smaller because you were so comprehensive in your introductory remarks. But fortunately, we've got many, many questions from the audience. So I'll start with one from Eugene Komarov of VOA Russia Service. He says, the UK became the first with battle tanks for Ukraine. Will the US also be the first with military aircraft for Ukraine? Granted, you're no longer in power, but you may have a
well, I kind of, look, I think the answer to that is look at what's happened. Every time we come to a fork in the road and we're asked to make a choice about sending some new type of weaponry to Ukraine to help them, we begin by saying no, and we begin by saying this is an escalation, this is a provocation, we mustn't do this. And I had this argument about the NLAWs, the anti-tank missiles, and then we've had it about all sorts of things. In the US, it was a very strong argument about the HIMARS, which then proved so valuable. So all I'm saying is experience teaches us that when it comes to it, we finally decide to let the Ukrainians have what they need to defend themselves. And so my argument to everybody today is that if that is where we're going to end up in our ratiocination, then let's do it now. And let's stop the delay and end this war as fast as possible, because that's the humane thing to do.
Okay, the next question comes from John Pett. He has two, but I'm just going to offer one so other questions get asked. Can you muse on what's left to be written about Putin's reign, how this will play out?
Well, you see, this is, again, whoever John is, he's trying to tempt me to do exactly what I don't want to do. I really, really, really don't want to get, because to be frank, I think that let's talk about the Russian people for a second. Because the tragedy is that the Russian people will think that if we start to talk about removing the ruler of Russia, then the Russian people will think, well, this is really what it's all about. It's an anti-Russian thing. They want to get rid of our leader. And that is not our focus. We should not be talking about regime change in Moscow. We should not be interested in that. We should not be talking about any impacts on the Kremlin, whatever. That is not what is at stake here. What is at stake is an innocent people suffering and our ability to alleviate that suffering now.
Okay. We have a question from Antonella Guerrera, who is the UK correspondent for La Repubblica.
She's normally in the UK.
This is coming in on.
Oh, okay,
we have a global
okay. She's not here.
audience.
Okay, right, okay. It's okay.
We have a global audience.
Intrepid Antonella, right, okay.
I'd have to say she was not pleased with your comments on NATO. So she says,
She's not pleased with it.
yes, she says, isn't it counterproductive, an unrealistic wish that Ukraine should join NATO, given the current situation and the fact that this horrible conflict might likely upgrade to a world war if Ukraine is attacked as a member of NATO?
Oh boy. I mean, okay, Antonella. Look, I mean, read the piece and listen to what I'm saying. It was the failure to be clear. It was the failure to offer any kind of real security guarantees to Ukraine that encouraged Putin to exploit the ambiguity. And I'm not saying that Ukraine should be admitted forthwith into NATO. That's plainly not going to happen. But I believe that the process, that there is now an inescapable logic of NATO membership, and NATO is a defensive alliance. All we would be doing is seeking to stop further bloodshed.
Thank you. All right, we have a question from Krakow, from Ian Kavanaugh. When victory comes, future Europeans will need to tell the tale of the victory. We can all see that despite Brexit, the UK has played a leading role in the European response. Which remaining EU states and actors will be well judged by historians for their role in this effort?
Look, I think that, well, first of all, that phrase, despite Brexit, let me just pick that one. I think...
Not my phrase.
No, it was your correspondent from Krakow. I seriously think that it was in part because of Brexit that we were able to take a decision and to have an approach that was very distinct from the old EU approach, which was, by the way, all governed by the fabled Normandy format. You remember the Normandy format, which was agreed at Normandy in 2014? For reasons that are now obscure to me, the British government decided that they did not need to be involved in this. France and Germany led it. That was the EU framework. If we'd stuck with that, I don't believe we would have delivered the NLAWs. And I think we would have taken a very, very different approach, to be perfectly frank. So I think because of Brexit, we've been able to do things differently and I hope in a way that has been useful to Ukraine. I think when I look around the table, all the countries that whenever people get together on this subject, they're driven by the logic of the position, international leaders, to support Ukraine, because there isn't a deal that you can do with Putin.
Correct.
And everybody spots that. France, Germany, wherever. We all come to the same conclusion. There's no way forward except backing the Ukrainians.
I'm going to throw in my own question here in response to what you just said. I agree that Putin has never wavered from his maximum demand of having political control of Ukraine. Others in Russia have sometimes talked about lesser goals. Yet there are Westerners who are always talking about negotiating with Putin, like they refuse to see this. How do you explain that?
Ben Judah was asking me the same question earlier on. I don't know. I think that we have a kind of a sort of fixation. I think probably each individual leader has a dream that they can be the person who finds the clue that unlocks the strong man in Moscow and delivers a deal. And I would just say that it's nonsense. And he's proved what he wants to do. What he wants to do is restore Russian prestige by undoing the humiliation of the end of the Soviet Union, and he's embarked on a catastrophic way of doing it.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Robin Brownsell about the upcoming Ukrainian Economic Reconstruction Conference that will be held in London. The question is, are you going to play a role, and do you have any thoughts on Ukrainian reconstruction?
I think the opportunities are colossal for business people around the world, for companies, for investors, to help this incredible country, and the returns will be sensational. I was listening to some very good presentations by, I think, Larry Fink of Blackstone and
Jamie.
It was Goldman Sachs.
Goldman Sachs.
We're also look at this. This is going to be. Ukrainians are brilliant people. They lead the world in all sorts of technologies. This is a country that's going to be worth investing in massively. We've just got to help them sort out Putin now.
Okay. Here's a question from Neil Katie Cruz. What should NATO do about cyber attacks and disinformation from Russia?
I don't think we're as good on this as we should be. And we need to be countering these arguments. I have been appalled to discover how many people, I've just been here for a couple of days. It's been wonderful. I always have a wonderful time in Washington. But I've been amazed and horrified by how many people are frightened of a guy called Tucker Carlson. Has anybody heard of Tucker Carlson? What is it with this guy? All these wonderful Republicans seem somehow intimidated by his perspective. And I haven't watched anything that he's said, but I'm struck by how often this comes up. Bad ideas are getting into starting to infect some of the thinking around the world about what Putin stands for, what he believes in. It's a disaster. He stands for war, aggression, systematic murder, rape, and destruction. That's what he stands for.
Okay, we have a question from Esmir Milovic of N1 TV, Bosnia-Herzegovina. Mr. Prime Minister, you have been mentioned the threat towards regions on the edges. Are you concerned that Mr. Putin might destabilize the region of the Western Balkans if he's successful in his war in Ukraine?
I care deeply about the Western Balkans, and I do worry about Russian provocations there. I remember what happened in Montenegro. All sorts of stuff has been going down there. They will continue to stir and to provoke. But to get back to my original point, all that will be reduced. All that instability, which could be very, very expensive for the West and for America, all that will diminish once the Ukrainians win.
We agree. Okay. We have a question from Andre Brondi. How can we stop Iran supplying Russia with drones and other weapons?
The way to do it, the fastest way to stop it is to help the Ukrainians to win. So that there's no, I'm sorry, am I sounding repetitive now? I don't care. Because that is frankly, otherwise this thing will go on, and the Iranians, as you rightly say, will continue to develop their manufacturing capability for drones. And who knows what they may do? Who knows what the Iranians might decide to do if they see that Putin can win in Ukraine? You know, it's not just the Chinese we need to think about, though I think that is the major problem. Think of the conclusions the Iranians will draw.
If we sent Ukraine the ATACMS, with missiles with a range of 300 kilometers, they could destroy those bases in Crimea.
They could.
Where the Iranian drones are raining just death and destruction. Okay.
I agree. Do you say ATACMS or ATACMS?
ATACMS is how I say it, but I'm not the most knowledgeable person.
It sounds like it sounds right, anyway.
Okay. All right. An anonymous attendee wants your take on this war as a conflict between autocracy and democracy, and what to make of the position of the world's largest democracy, in other words, India.
Yeah. Look, I think there's an element of truth in the idea that this is a conflict between autocracy and democracy. I think Putin, I said Putin was motivated by a desire to rebuild the old Soviet empire. I think he was also deeply, whatever Ukraine's problems, and we should acknowledge that Ukraine is not a perfect state or society. There are issues of corruption that need to be tackled, but it is a million times better than Russia, and it's heading in the right direction. It's heading towards, it has a Western, a European vocation, and it is a democracy. I mean, there are people who stand for election in Ukraine who might not win, unlike Putin, right? It is a democracy, and I don't think Putin liked that, and that was what he was trying to demolish. He wanted to bring it into his fold.
Okay. All right. I'm going to risk my future as a moderator here at the Atlantic Council by breaking with protocol and taking a question from the floor from the inestimable Harlan Ullman.
Prime Minister, good to see you.
Nice to see you.
I want to congratulate you on being the first American to be Prime Minister. We waited a long time for that.
I know. Tragically, because of the very considerable demands of the Inland Revenue Service here in this country, I had to give up that my passport in order to do that. But anyway,
My question is more serious, and it is the contradiction in how you resolve between principle and reality. No one would disagree with the moral and political arguments you gave for aiding Ukraine, but what it would take in order to return the boundaries back to February 24th are considerable. They're talking about thousands of tanks. Britain has given 14 Challengers. That only leaves you 150. We're talking about thousands of fighting vehicles, aircraft, ATACMs, all sorts of equipment that's very unlikely to be delivered in quantity and time to do this. So what is your plan B if we cannot reconcile the arguments you make in principle with the reality that it's unlikely we're going to be able to deliver the stuff that's needed for Ukraine to get its borders back to February 24th, let alone to take a position that can be even more aggressive?
thank you so much. Look, every time in this conflict so far, we've overestimated Putin and we've underestimated what the Ukrainians can do. We said, don't forget what we said at the beginning. We said he was going to take Kiev in a week. That was the view on this side of the Atlantic. It was the view in London, right? That was totally wrong. The Ukrainians have proved themselves able to use our technology to massively destructive effect. They've taken back not just Kiev, but they took back Kherson, Kharkiv. They can take back very considerable chunks of territory. They are very convincing on this point. I mean, they think that if they have the right kit in the right quantities, they can take back the post-February the 24th ground. I think that I'm listening to them, watching what they can do. That's a compelling argument. Why don't we at least give them the tools to do it? That's what we should do.
Okay, I broke the protocol once. The last question will also come from the audience right here. And please identify yourself.
Prime Minister, thank you for your leadership, first of all. Pavel Popescu, Romanian Parliament. My question is this. Considering the fact that my country defends 613 kilometers, the longest NATO border with Ukraine, 681 with our small sister Republic of Moldova, and considering the fact that the US Congress just set up the base for legislation for a Black Sea strategy, I would like to ask you, how important do you think that while solving the acute problem in Ukraine and continuing to deliver weapons, we should concentrate on a Black Sea region strategy? How acute do you think this is?
Sorry, forgive me. You said which country did you say?
Romania.
Romania, yes, of course. Sorry.
So, do we need a Black Sea security strategy these days, and how important do you think it is?
Yeah, look, I think Romania, certainly Moldova, is one of those areas that is directly impacted by any kind of Putin success. And if he's able to hold any part of the land bridge, then he'll be able to portray this to the Russian people as a victory. He'll lick his wounds. He'll regroup. He'll remain in power. Not that that should be a consideration. And he will attack again, or he will try to threaten again. He basically thinks that what happened to the Baltic states when they joined NATO was an absolute humiliation for Moscow, and he wants to reverse it. I think he wants to rebuild Russian influence throughout the whole zone of Eastern Europe. Help the Ukrainians to win now and win fast. You push all that back. You end that nonsense. You save colossal sums of money.
And that's the final word. Mr. Johnson, thank you very much for being with us today. It was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.